Hey, what's up YouTube? In today's short video, I'm going to demonstrate a technique to render a 3D distance field in Blender using geometry nodes. I'll make a video dedicated to distance fields and what you can do with them in the near future, and so I'm going to keep this video somewhat short. Thus, it might not make much sense if you're not familiar with distance fields. Apologies. Anyway, let's dive into it. Here's a short demonstration. Let's use our beloved Suzanne. Pick it here and that's it. My tool creates a flat piece of geometry in unit space, centered on the world origin. So I just have to create a camera and position it at 0 in X and Y to render that geometry from a top-down perspective using an orthographic projection. Make sure to use linear color space and voila. Each slice in Z is rendered one after the other in that 2D texture, and that texture can be converted to a volume texture in most game engines, including Unreal Engine. With a 3D distance field, you can then do plenty of crazy things, including driving the density in a volumetric cloud shader like I explained in my last video. So how does this work? The idea is the following. First, get the mesh bounding box. Next, using a 3D grid pattern, fill that bounding box with points. At each point, sample the nearest surface's position, and figure out how distant that surface is to the point. Next, do a single ray cast to find out if this point is inside the mesh and thus create a signed distance field, meaning store a negative distance if inside the mesh. It's also possible to check all points and retrieve the maximum distance to normalize the distance field. Once that distance is cached in each point, lay them flat to render each horizontal slice one after the other and voila. It doesn't sound too bad, right? Now the implementation requires a bit of math, but nothing too crazy. The biggest challenge comes from having to convert back and forth between a linear index and a 3D index. And it's a topic I already explained in detail in a previous video, so I won't go over that again. Alright, let's dive into the nodes. Keep in mind I've only been very recently fooling around with geometry nodes, so I'm new to it. So please let me know in the comments below if you see things that could be improved. Alright, here I spawn points, voxels, as many as there needs to be in X, Y and Z. For each voxel, I convert its linear index into a 3D index. Index, say 412, in a 16 by 16 by 16 grid would be index 12 in X, 9 in Y and 1 in Z, right? It's divided by the voxel resolution in X, Y and Z to normalize that 3D index in a 0 to 1 range. Having that unit index, I compute the voxel's unit position based on the geometry's bounding box. Moreover, I compute the voxel size also based on the bounding box and number of voxels in X, Y and Z. I also add a half unit offset to center the voxel on itself, if that makes sense. Neat, voxels are now properly placed within the geometry's bounding box, which, by the way, can be arbitrarily scaled up to create empty space around the geometry, useful when it comes to distance fields. Anyway, at each voxel I sample the nearest surface on the geometry. I get that position to compute the distance to the voxel. That's what creates the distance field. To be a signed distance field, meaning to contain negative distances when inside the mesh, I do a single ray cast in an arbitrary direction. If the hit normal, if a hit is found, points in a direction opposite to the ray direction, it means the voxel is inside the geometry, so the distance is flipped. Next, using an attribute statistic node, the distance is remapped into a 0 to 1 range, so the distance field can be rendered into an 8-bit texture if needed. Therefore, 0.5 is considered as on the surface. 0 would be the most distant voxel inside the mesh, and 1 same thing but outside the mesh. Once the distance field is cached, voxels are laid flat in 2D space. So based on the voxel's 3D index, unit index, and the number of horizontal slices to display in width, I compute a new 2D unit position. And that's to position voxels in that -0.5 to 0.5 area, so they can be easily rendered from a top-down perspective using a camera centered on the world origin. I then instantiate a plane on each voxel with a proper scale. Next, for debug purposes, I can delete voxels that store a distance that does not match a certain threshold. Again, a normalized distance of 0.5 should be right on the mesh, so a threshold of 0.5 should show voxels that are inside the geometry, and that's what I get. Finally, the distance is plugged into a linear color output pin, and that allows me to link that color to a face attribute, meaning write the distance to vertex color. Using a simple emissive shader, that color can be rendered, and voila! Make sure to turn off color correction. Use a 16 bits file format, save, import the texture into UE, convert the texture to a volume texture, make sure frames are properly configured, sample it in a shader, and tada! A 3D distance field of Suzanne. And that's my geometry nodes setup for rendering 3D distance fields in Blender. Again, let me know if you see things that could be improved. It's definitely super duper slow with many voxels, so I'm especially looking for ways to improve performance. Keep in mind 3D distance fields can easily be rendered in Unreal Engine using Niagara, but then modeling in Unreal Engine is, let's be honest, atrocious, at least compared to a DCC software, because, well, UE is not a DCC software, so you can't expect it to perform miracles in that domain. And I was looking for ways to model volumetric clouds, and doing that in Blender using geometry nodes is super easy. And having to export that mesh to UE just to render a distance field gets old real fast. Hence why I looked into a method to render a distance field in Blender, and that's the best I could come up with. Let me know if you know a better solution. Alright, that's it for today's video. Short and sweet. I hope you found it useful. In case you want to support me, the blend file is available as a tier 1 reward on my Patreon. Speaking of, thanks to all my patrons for the amazing support. And thanks to you for watching. Consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel if you liked the video. I'll see you in the next one. In the meantime, take care of yourself. Bye bye!